everyone, and welcome back to our podcast series. My name is Catherine, and in this episode, we're going to take a closer look at one of the darkest consequences of the Black Death, the persecution of Jewish communities across Europe. Before we dive into things, here's a little bit about myself. I'm a senior studying public health sciences at the University of Michigan, and after graduation, I will be pursuing an NPH in nutrition and dietetics to eventually become a registered dietitian. In the last episode, Anita introduced the Black Death as a devastating pandemic that swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing nearly a third of the population. At the time, people didn't understand that the disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, or how it spread. Without that knowledge, fear and uncertainty shaped how people responded. So today, we're going to talk about what happened to Jewish communities during this time, why they were targeted, and how social and religious systems allowed this persecution to unfold. To start, it's important to understand that anti-Semitism in Europe did not begin with the Black Death. Jewish communities had long been viewed with suspicion and were often accused of harmful acts like poisoning wells or practicing magic. These ideas were already present in medieval society due to the separation of Christianity from Judaism in the 1st century AD, leading to different religious belief systems. These differences created a foundation for what would happen during the plague. When the Black Death began spreading rapidly and killing millions, people were desperate for answers. Without scientific explanations, many turned to religion. In Catholic Europe, a common belief was that the plague was a punishment from God for human sin. But as the death toll kept rising, even among the faithful, some people began searching for more immediate human causes. That's where Jewish communities became scapegoats. One of the most widespread accusations was that Jews were poisoning wells to deliberately spread the disease. This claim had no scientific basis, but it spread quickly through rumor and fear. Underlying tensions finally came to the surface as stressful situations exacerbated the negative perception of Jews, leading to active action against them. In many towns, forced confessions were extracted through torture, which only reinforced these false beliefs in the eyes of the public. The consequences were devastating. Across Europe, Jewish communities faced violence, expulsion, and mass killings. Historical records estimate that at least 235 Jewish communities experienced persecution during this period. In some regions, entire Jewish populations were wiped out. For example, in 1348, massacres occurred in parts of southern France and Spain. In 1349, Jews were burned alive in large groups in cities across Germany. In Strasbourg, one of the most well-documented events, hundreds of Jews were killed despite the fact that the plague had not yet even reached the city. So how did this happen on such a large scale? To answer this question, we need to look at the role of social and political power, especially the influence of the Catholic Church in local governments. During the 14th century, the Catholic Church held enormous authority in Europe. It shaped how people understood the world, including disease. While not all church leaders supported violence against Jews, Catholic teachings and interpretations contributed to a climate where Jews were seen as outsiders or even enemies. Some extremist religious groups, like the Flagellants, took this even further. These groups believed that extreme acts of repentance, like publicly whipping themselves, could atone for humanity's sins. But they also promoted the idea that Jews were responsible for the plague, and in some cases, they led violent attacks on Jewish communities. Local governments often failed to stop this violence. In fact, many officials either allowed it to happen or actively supported it. In some cases, rulers even benefited financially, as persecuted Jewish communities were forced to abandon property and wealth. Although there were notable efforts from higher religious leadership to discourage violence and promote protection, these messages were not always consistently enforced at the local level. As a result, the gap between official guidance and everyday practice allowed tensions and violence to persist in many communities. Another important factor to consider is why Jewish communities may have appeared less affected by the plague in some areas. Some historians suggest that certain Jewish practices, such as ritual hand-washing and dietary laws, may have unintentionally reduced exposure to the disease. Others point to possible genetic factors that could have influenced survival rates. However, these differences were often interpreted as evidence of guilt. The logic was that if Jews weren't dying at the same rate, they must have been responsible. Many Jewish survivors of the Black Death violence were forced to flee to other regions, including Eastern Europe, where Jewish populations later became more concentrated. In this way, the persecution during the Black Death reshaped the demographic and cultural landscape of Europe for centuries. So, what can we take away from all of this? The persecution of Jews during the Black Death was not caused by the disease itself, but by how people responded to it. Fear, combined with a lack of structural scientific understanding and existing social biases, created the conditions for scapegoating and violence. It also highlights the powerful role that institutions, like the church and government, play in shaping public response during a crisis. When those institutions fail to challenge misinformation or protect vulnerable populations, the consequences can be severe. As we think about this in a modern context, there are clear parallels. During recent public health crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen similar patterns of misinformation and blame directed at specific groups. Understanding what happened during the Black Death can help us recognize these patterns and respond differently in the future. Well, that's all for today's episode. In the next episode, Emma will take a deeper dive into the Catholic Church itself, exploring the different perspectives within the church hierarchy and how those divisions influenced what we've talked about today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.